Hello and welcome to this month's insaka. Our two guests today will speak on informal sector mineral extraction and decolonization. Now, as we all know, the informal sector in Africa matters. It's not to be brushed aside. Significant populations depend on it for their livelihoods. The first talk reflects on the conditions under which small-scale mineral extraction takes place and interventions that promote sustainable mining. And last month, we had a talk on the 1950s campaign that argued for the restitution of looted African artwork and how that campaign relates to the current wave of international pressure. The second talk today is very much in keeping with this renewed activism for decolonial movements across the globe. It draws on the history of anti-imperialist movements in Southern Africa to shed light on the original Rhodes must fall movements and challenges the view that decolonization is diversity inclusion. About our two speakers, Professor Judy Muthuri and Dr. Naseemah Mohamed. Judy is Associate Professor of Corporate Social Responsibility and the Chair of Social and Environmental Responsibility Group at the University of Nottingham. Her research interests are focused on corporate social responsibility, ethics, and sustainability. Naseemah is a postdoctoral researcher at Frank Barton School of Leadership and Public Policy at the University of Virginia. She was a Rhodes Scholar here in Oxford and completed a PhD on the history of education and the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe. As is usual practice, the speakers will each give a 15-minute talk in succession, and the Q&A will be after both talks, and we'll be very much looking forward to your questions. If you'd like to post them anonymously, we have the Slido code available in the chat box for you. And first up is Judy, and her talk is on informal miners and the co-production for sustainable artisanal and small-scale mining in Kenya. Judy, welcome.
Thank you so much, Watu, and to all your colleagues for inviting me to share my research with you. And I look forward to an interesting conversation on sustainability and informal mining in Africa. So my talk will focus on a multidisciplinary project I've been leading on since 2019, which is funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund, titled Co-Production for Sustainable Artisanal and Small-Scale Mining in Kenya. So when I say ASM, it's the short form for artisanal and small-scale mining. I'm working with many partners here in the UK and in Kenya. And in Kenya, I'm working with the only mining university, which is Taita Taveta University, and the Versatile School of Photography, and in the UK, New Vic Borderlines, and different faculty members within my university. So artisanal ASM sector in sub-Saharan Africa continues to grow considerably, and we don't have the exact figures, but we know that approximately 13 million individuals, 70 to 80% of those are informal workers. And these are pretty a huge number compared to large scale and mining, for example. We also know that the prevalence of poverty and unemployment in sub-Saharan Africa continues to fuel the growth of informality in the mining sector, and increasingly, thanks to COVID-19, the situation has worsened and many more individuals are joining the sector, driven by the inability to find alternative work that can meet their immediate basic needs. Miners are vulnerable individuals, mostly trapped in vicious poverty cycles, and informal mining, it becomes a deliberate production strategy to optimize their chances of moving out of dire poverty. The ASM again contributes significantly to global production of metals and mineral resources, and a recent report by the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, Metals, and Sustainable Development gives an estimation of the share of global supply chain to from the ASM, like diamonds, for example, we know it's 20%, sapphires is 80%. These figures may differ across countries. For example, whereas the global figure for gold is 20%, we know in Ghana, we are talking of 35% of total gold production in the country being contributed by this sector. The Africa Mining Vision also says that almost all African gemstones, except diamonds, are produced by ASM. In Kenya, it's 60% of the annual gemstone production is attributed to the sector. So it's an important income generator as well as a foreign exchange earner in many African countries, and therefore we cannot ignore it. And it is an important pillar in the African Mining Vision 2019. In Kenya, just to quickly give you the context, artisanal mining for a long time was not recognized in the mining regime. It was actually outlawed. Kenya government only recognized large scale and small mining. It was clearly defined. This only changed in 2016 with the new Mining Act. So the miners, the artisanal miners, were labeled Zururas. Zururas is a Swahili name meaning moving about or wanderers. And so essentially they were left out of policy making processes, and they did not benefit at all. So whereas the new regime, mineral regime, is new and is evolving, we know that the implementation gaps. We also know we have weak regulatory and governance arrangements. They could be weak or there could be gaps. You know, the artisanal ASM strategy is yet to be developed, for example. From an industry point of view, I've already said it significantly contributes to gemstone production, so you can't ignore it in terms of its production capabilities. However, it's very informal, you know, courtesy of it not being legislated for a long time. Only beginning of this year did the artisanal committee that is supposed to be legislating or overseeing the legislation of the artisanal miners was gazetted. So you can see, or you know, there's a slow progress in terms of implementation of the mining gaps. So the sector is problematic insofar as sustainability issues are concerned. But we also recognize that when it comes to sustainability and sustainable practices, a lot of international, national, regional policy interventions, industry practices are built and developed and designed with a large mining sector in mind. And they are and any interventions are developed for miners rather than with artisanal miners, especially with the post-2016 regime, when they realized, you know, these artisanal miners must be included in the governance. So what we did, next slide, is that although the new mining regime, we believe it creates opportunities to drive the industry, you know, further and make it more sustainable, it faces significant challenges. The sector, although the new mining regime promises to help create environmentally friendly, social responsible mining practices, there are many gaps. And the question is, how do we engage informal miners in advancing a sustainable mining future? While we know that the miners have completely been excluded, you know, historically, that is, in the mining governance processes. So all these gaps are what inspired the start of the Sastazim project in 2019, where we are engaging mining stakeholders in Taita Taveta County to co-produce their own solutions to the sustainable challenges that face them. So we adopted cultural animation methodology, which is very participatory, it is very context sensitive, and knowing the kind of people that we are dealing with and the stakeholders that we are dealing with, the co-creation process involved music, drama, boundary object activities, focus groups, and essentially provided different platforms for these mining stakeholders to use their rich experiences and understanding to frame sustainability in their own language and to develop a sustainability action plan. And our hope was that this will complement government efforts, as the government was yet to develop a long-term ASM strategy. So the cultural animation approach was very important for us because it helped us build very trusting relationship between diverse participants by inviting them to work together in a series of activities, which started with a picture of them presenting their vision of what a desirable mining future might look like in Taita Taveta, and proceeding to develop interventions to address that. The strategy also was helpful because it gave life to the dynamics of everyday life by encouraging participants to reflect on the potential for change within themselves and their own communities. And you can imagine when you bring the minister in the same room with, let's say, an informal miner with limited education, experts and non-experts, they're in the same room, they are singing, they are doing role plays, they are dramatizing, they are doing all these things. That helps dissolve hierarchies, and it helps create and encourage multiple ways of knowing and types of knowledge, and also, helps them to begin to bring the barriers that they've had in the past. So the next slide really shows us, a product. Sorry, it is a very small print, but I thought, let me share with you some of the processes that they went through. Once they mapped out all the sustainability issues and they included, social exclusion, land dispossession, socioeconomic deprivation, environmental degradation, to name a few. We later then mapped into the SDG because it was important for us to understand the extent to which the sector was contributing to or not contributing to the attainment of the SDG goals. So as expected, the issues are numerous, complex, they are interconnected, interdependent. Some are more urgent than others, some are more prominent than others, and therefore they can, there's contestation happening. And what we then did, and this is my last bit in terms of, trying to really summarize some of the key highlights of the program, because we can spend the whole day talking about it. In the next slide, I present to you, some of the things that we've been able to achieve. So as stakeholders came together in 2020, we launched the Multi-Stakeholder Dialogue Forum. For me, this is what I call the legacy project. And this MSDF, or Multi-Stakeholder Dialogue Forum, brings together these actors, and they begin to collaborate and begin to create interventions around their sector. So what you're seeing there is we developed a sustainable mining action plan. It's a 5-year action plan with clear interventions, who to engage, which stakeholders to engage. And really it's an evidence of how a good dialogue process can develop an intervention or a solution to a problem. And the next slide is, again, I just brought it there for you guys to see what our theory of change is, because this is a bottom-up approach to sustainable development. And they've come together, they've decided, these are our sustainability issues. These are the things that we need to, create an enabling environment for sustainable ASM. It includes, for example, engaging and improving the market access, empowering them, building capacities, etc., etc. And they have clear goals and impacts. So in summary, I would say that the collaboration process, and importantly, the participatory approach is an important one when we think of informal miners and stakeholders who are engaging in an informal economy. And that process for us was helpful because it challenged their own perceptions, their own attitude, their own behaviors that contribute to unsustainable mining. And what we have seen in the 2.5 years that I've been working with the Magadi, the Taita Taveta people, is that there is a clear intention for them to be their own agents of development. They have established an MSDF secretariat that meets every month, and this secretariat is represented. We have representatives from the local government, national government, the institutions of higher learning, NGOs, the ASM. They meet every month, and I'm part of that process, and we report every month, and we track progress, and we set strategies from the action plan that I introduced you to, in terms of making steps to accelerate progress. So I'll finish off by saying thank you very much for this opportunity. We can talk more in the question and answer session, and I invite those that are interested to join me in this intervention project. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Judy, for that very interesting piece of work. And it's clearly a bottom-up approach that is trying to sort of pave the way to engage much more with people who have been traditionally excluded from society, and them really having an agency that allows them to voice their issues and their ways of understanding how to go about their livelihoods. We'll be coming back to you after the second talk with questions. So we're now going to move on to our second talk by Naseemah, and it is titled The History of Decolonization and the Decolonization of History. Welcome, Naseemah.
Thank you very much. Let me pull up my slides. Thank you very much. The history of decolonization and the decolonization of history. Historical lessons learned for today's decolonial fight. The most recent Rhodes Must Fall protests, which called for decolonization, began in March 2015 at the University of Cape Town, where Chumani Makwele threw a bucket of excrement on the bronze statue of arch-imperialist and diamond magnate Cecil John Rhodes. The calls for racial justice and the removal of statue inspired international protests, including one right here, well, we're virtual, in Oxford, which called for the removal of the statue of Cecil John Rhodes, the benefactor of the Rhodes Scholarships and alumnus of Oriel College, from its stately position overlooking the Oxford High Street. The calls for the defacements of other symbols of imperial power, including the destruction of the 17th century slave owner, Edward Colson, in Bristol, is featured here when they're throwing him into the river. And for many, these protests were long overdue reckoning and were made even more poignant as they coincided and emerged with Black Lives Matter protests against police brutality in the US through connections and coordination on social media. Here we see the Black Lives Matter protests. Now, while the use of social media as a tool for political solidarity is certainly novel, in this talk, I will highlight how the Rhodes Must Fall movement and even the recent swelling of transnational solidarity movements against racial injustice are contemporary resurgences of older Black radical decolonial independence movements. I will argue that these continuities demonstrate the importance and relevance of the study of these historical political movements, which also point to the present need for the radical redefinition of the current rhetoric around decolonization. In my research on the Zimbabwean liberation struggle for my DPhil, I interviewed veterans and studied texts from Zimbabwe's African People's Union, one of the two foremost liberation movements which fought against the Rhodesian government for Zimbabwean independence from 1965 to 1980. I was surprised and frankly unsettled to come across historical descriptions of student protests in the 60s and 70s, which were eerily reminiscent of the recent Rhodes Must Fall movements. And a few decades earlier, even criticisms of Cecil Rhodes from the sharp pen of Mark Twain, the author, who put to shame many contemporary critiques of the founder of the Rhodes Scholarship. For example, in one of the writings from Zapu's publication, the Zimbabwean African Review, an article from August 11th, 1973, entitled Unrest in South Africa and Rhodesian Universities, describes how non-white students demanding full academic rights led protests at the University of Rhodesia in Salisbury, which is modern Harare, which culminated in the protest at the foot of the statue of arch-imperialist and colonialist Cecil John Rhodes. In response to these protests, student protest leaders were expelled, suspended, and many were arrested after being brutally assaulted by the police. As these examples demonstrate, Cecil Rhodes is a painfully powerful reminder of the symbol of white supremacy and colonial imperialism and the need for structural reform of colonial economic and racial structures. Moreover, both the independence movements of the 60s and 80s and contemporary movements for decolonization and social justice, though geographically specific in their goals, are part of a broader transnational movement. So here, mirroring the Black Lives Matter and Rhodes Must Fall coalitions presently, you'll see an article on the right from a Zapu publication in 1969, which noted that while the US was able to land a man on the moon, it was unable to end racial discrimination against Negroes in America. I love this quote: "We would rather be brought the minds of white Americans from the moon down to earth where their fellow human beings live in squalor. The racialist complexion of American thinking is shown very clearly by the fact that Negroes are drafted in large numbers to fight in immoral wars, such as the Vietnam one." In studying both present and former decolonial movements, it becomes clear that the present-day legacy of colonialism, and Rhodes specifically, reach far beyond his scholarship and statue. Here, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is presently very important, has its roots in Rhodes's colonial project and is as pressing today as it was when the Pan-African independence movements joined in solidarity against the project. Theodor Herzl, 1860 to 1904, the father of political Zionism, models his plans for the Jewish colonial project directly on Rhodes's colonial policies in Rhodesia. He was enamored with and inspired by Rhodes, and wrote in his diary a letter which he penned, but did not send to Rhodes before Rhodes died. And in the letter he said, "You are being invited to help make history. It does not involve Africa, but a piece of Asia Minor, not Englishmen, but Jews. How then do I happen to turn to you, since this is an out of the way matter for you?" How indeed, because it is something colonial. You, Mr. Rhodes, are a visionary politician or a practical visionary. I want you to put the stamp of your authority on the Zionist plan and make the following declaration to a few people who swear by you. I, Rhodes, have examined this plan and found it correct and practicable. It is a plan full of culture, excellence, for the group of people for whom it is directly designed, and quite good for England and Greater Britain. So while Herzl did not live to see his colonial state come to fruition, he is considered the spiritual leader of the Israeli state. And as he laid the practical foundations for the institution, they continue to wreak havoc today. Many post-colonial African nations adopted the very same colonial and legal and economic structures which aided colonial powers in resource extraction and human exploitation. These very same structures are presently used, often with even more impunity, against their own people. But there is also a positive note to studying this history. The awareness of the connections between present injustices and colonial wrongs is so strong that recent calls for reparations and justice for victims of colonialism are gaining momentum. Just last week, the German government agreed to pay 1.1 billion euros for the genocide of the Herero Nyama genocide in Namibia. While they refused to use the language of genocide and reparations, their payment is proof of some acceptance of culpability. On the right-hand side, we see Kenyans who were tortured in British gulags, who in 2012 won the right to sue the British government for their ill treatment. Though this was only after a white American researcher, Professor Caroline Elkins, carried out hundreds of interviews of victims of the gulags and scoured colonial records to demonstrate the extent of the atrocities. By studying history and the decolonial movements, we are studying the very foundations of our present age and the structures against which we continue to fight. The world we've inherited is the way it is because these histories have made it that way. We also learn that the decolonial movements garnered success through transnational cooperations. They were not unintellectual. Their leadership was some of the most educated political leaders of our time. And in the context of the Cold War, with Chinese and Soviet funding, African, Middle Eastern, and Asian movements, they supported one another in innumerable ways. Occupied Palestinians raised money and the alarm for the ANC in South Africa. Finally, in studying these movements and their continuities with present struggles, we are led to ask, why has the status quo remained? The decolonial independence movements aimed to gain sovereignty from colonial powers, and to an extent, they were successful. So why has so much remained the same? And what does decolonialization mean for us today? We say one cannot tear down the master's house with the master's tools. That's a saying. I believe that the continuation of the neo-colonial enterprise is in no small part due to the political limitations of the previous independence movements. While they no doubt understood the need to reimagine state structures, and many like Thomas Sankara did, they had to balance the intellectual decolonial exercise with the backdrop of the Cold War and the political and physical battles they had to fight. In numerous ways, they imagined future states were framed by the Western traditions and political theories, as the majority of their leadership had studied in Western schools. In short, they won certain degree of control of the colonial state, but did not transform its very nature. Even as an educationist, I recognize that the colonial enterprise, replete with ideological, cultural, and linguistic Western supremacy, is enmeshed and perpetuated by the Western educational systems. When cultures, languages, and indigenous knowledge systems are supplanted by foreign ideologies, when old people, the living libraries of knowledge, die, the Western education model erases every trace of their intellectual legacy. Western education even erases its own erasure. Like the myth within colonialism that claims that lands were empty and barren before the colonizers seized them, Western education models perpetuate the erasure of even the memory of the possibility of previous full systems of knowledge. What we choose not to teach our children has been the ultimate form of cancel culture and has existed for generations. It is important to remember that Western colonialism did not triumph because colonial ideologies, values, and morals were superior to those they conquered. There were no records of converts to Christianity in former Rhodesia until Rhodes led a violent conquest against the state. They triumphed by cunning and superior weaponry, as educator Oludamini Ogunaike states. Just because the playground bully can beat you up doesn't mean he's better at math. So, what is decolonization? Decolonization, at its foundation, is epistemological. True decolonization redefines the nature, origin, and the limits of human knowledge and the cosmological, social, political, and economic possibilities they entail. The notions of nation states, the purpose and kinds of knowledge acquisition, and the very definition of what it means to be a person must radically be called into question. Decolonization is not a metaphor for diversity and inclusion or increasing indigenous history in our curricula. While these are important, they're a start. But true decolonization means rethinking the very nature of education and what it aims to produce. As scholars, for example, we must ask ourselves, what is the purpose of education? Are our pedagogical methods, school structures, and even our political and economic structures commensurate with that very purpose? So one of the dangers of the ubiquitous calls for decolonization in present movements is that the language can be co-opted to fit within the progressive notions of diversity and inclusion. Poluke Adebisi has even called for decolonization of decolonization for this reason. While diversity and inclusion are very important, too often it has meant the placement of marginalized groups within reified dominant group structures. Having a high percentage of Black workers does not mean an institution cannot be racist. If this were the case, American slave plantations had a very high percentage of Black workers. Were they diverse? Yes. Were they inclusive? Of course not. So we will know that we have decolonized when the myth of the universality of the Western has become undone, when the world is no longer divided into the West and the rest. Decolonization, therefore, is the redefinition of the status quo. It is a radical reimagining, which is difficult to do because we are embedded within a system that we need to seek to get out of, which is why Fanon noted decolonization, which sets out to change and reorder the world, is obviously a program of complete disorder, a historical process. That is to say, it cannot be understood, it cannot become intelligible, nor clear to itself, except in the exact measure that we can discern the movements which gave it historical form and content. He writes us in Wretched of the Earth. Thankfully, in addition to protests and activism, scholars such as Adam Getchu and Eleni Zeleke are pioneering intellectual decolonial work on the histories of African independence movements, and others such as Professor Sabolo Dlovugacheni and Oludamini Ogunaike, who take indigenous knowledge not merely as anthropological studies, but deal with them on their own political and philosophical terms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Naseemah, for that very eye-opening presentation about the reasons why, or at least some of the reasons why, decolonization seems to not have necessarily made as much progress as one might want. And in fact, I'm sure there are many questions that will come to you wanting to understand more about how to decolonize decolonization. And so we shall move straight to the questions now. And just to give you a break, Naseemah, I'm going to start with Judy. And Judy, you touched on very many issues in a very concise and sort of clear way. And there's a lot that is packed in there. And I'm sure we will not be able to touch on everything, but some of the things that come to mind is in this sort of nascent informal sector, and it's not exactly nascent, except insofar as it became recognized in 2016. It was previously outlawed, but that does not necessarily mean that it was not happening, or in fact, maybe it had been happening over centuries. You might want to tell us more about that there might even be traditional knowledge of mining that was simply hidden away because it was against the law. But I think the question here really is, normally what happens when you have an informal sector set against the government wanting to help it out, it's very often about making it formal. And it would be useful to know more about that and how it might impact the people who are in the informal sector, because as you've very clearly pointed out, they're sort of socioeconomically excluded, they have limited education and so on and so forth. And technically speaking, when you try to make something formal, basically you just leave them out. So perhaps you can tell us more about that.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a really great insight. Just to say that a lot of the gemstone mining was happening. So let's put it this way, that it was tolerated. So they allowed it to continue, working, because that's their indigenous way of, their livelihood. So it's very much connected to what Naseemah was talking about, so they had their own indigenous way of mining. So they've used their mining knowledge passed generation to generation. Now, if those who followed the informal economy and the policy interventions, whether it is by the World Bank, international organizations at the national level, they've been pushing the formalization of the informal sector. So shifting from the informal to the formal. And what that means is that they begin to register, license in, small and micro miners, and with registering them, it means that they are mainstreamed in the formal economy. So they pay taxes, they have to comply with everything, the whole shebang of formality. And we know the formal sector also has a very high cost of doing business. And increasingly, there is evidence to show that formalization agenda is failing. Actually, it is leading to a worse situation than envisaged. And therefore, for us, our project was, how do you ensure that you're changing practices using and capitalizing on indigenous knowledge tapping on their goodwill, doing the things that the formalization agenda expects them to do. So, you know, environmental sustainability, social inclusion, and all these things, without pushing them into the formal sector. Because when you push the formalization agenda and the cost of the formalization, they go underground. So there's a lot of cons of the formalization process. And so for us, it is important to acknowledge that formalization is not the all solution to the informal sector, that we have to be creative and working with these people that may not necessarily, you know, tick all the formal, the formality process, and allow a blended approach. And I think that is where also the policy makers are moving towards, even if they want formalization for taxation process and stuff like that, they are acknowledging their limitations, and not everybody will shift from the formal to the informal to the formal. So for us is, how do we navigate that terrain and bring everybody along? The SDG talks about, you know, bringing everybody along. So how do you do that? And this is the kind of conversations we are having in Taita Taveta.
Thank you. I mean, there is quite a lot there, because, you know, it's not as at all straightforward, you know, very clearly from what you've said. And in fact, you've ended up responding to at least 3 or 4 questions all in one go. So I'm not going to repeat them. There was a question about the tax system and how this is going to affect the informal miners. There was something about control by the formal sector and the markets and all the rest of it. You've also touched on that. And actually, maybe you might want to elaborate a little bit more on when they go underground, assuming that, you know, when the formalization project doesn't work very well, and the informal miners end up, you know, going underground. How do they then exactly connect with markets? Because at the end of the day, they will want to sell their gemstones, and these gemstones will find their way to the formal market. Does it mean that they end up in a situation where that is very extractive anyway? They were running away from taxes, and then they end up, you know, in the black market where, you know, something different is happening and they're also losing out.
Yeah, so there's the supply chain. I didn't show you the supply chain map for you to understand the complexity of the supply chain. So there is the formal supply chain, and then which deals with very high-end gemstone, you know, the gemstones themselves. And then there's this other one. So there's a lot of things that happens, you know, market actors are in place, and you find in Kenya, some of these might be registered, others are not registered. So there's a lot of gaps in this. And what we are trying to do is, the government of Kenya established what you call the Voi Gemstone Value Addition Center. And the Value Addition Center is to support the artisanal miners in terms of providing market linkages, and hopefully, you know, bypass all these, you know, these informal, some illegal, you know, market players that will always want to, you know, manipulate the artisanal miners who don't even know the value of their, you know, gemstones, because, you know, they don't have knowledge. Others are not connected to the international market. So we are hoping, and these people are part of this project. So we are working with them to encourage, you know, and support the informal miners to make use of these existing facilities. And even if they don't, they need to still continue engaging, but with a little bit of more market information. So there's a lot of work, Watu. So this is just like we said, the mining regime is quite new, and there's a lot of work that is needed on the ground, whether it is, in the market structure, whether it is building capacity of these miners, whether it's even the geological and the technological, the technical aspects of mining, so there's a lot. And the action plan actually provides, different interventions on how many or different stakeholders can come together to improve the capacity of these miners.
Thanks. There's certainly a lot to think about. I'm going to go to Naseemah.
Yes.
Naseemah, is the combining of the Rhodes Must Fall and Black Lives Matter movement helping or watering down both movements?
That's a great question. I think that they are helping in some ways, both helping and watering down. It's not an easy question. I think what we've seen is that they have historically come together because they are part of the same structures. And I think that while they're helping each other, they could be even more powerful if people acknowledge the shared history. And that is, I think Professor Sabelo Ndlovukacheni mentioned this in a Facebook post, but the rise of Trump in America makes complete sense if you view America as a colonial white settler state. If you think about it, Americans came from Britain, the settlers, they settled on Native American land, pushed natives out towards their lands, and took over and said, had this grand vision, very much like Rhodes, of building, like taking up as much space as possible from the east to the west coast. It was a colonial mission, and it remains a white settler government, which is why, for example, the Ku Klux Klan, the same Ku Klux Klan, we have video evidence of them burning churches and killing people that were instated with a racist ideology, have not been declared a terrorist group or outlawed in America. There's no law against the Ku Klux Klan to outlaw it as a terrorist organization. And so the rise of Trump, and I think the Black Lives Matter movement, is really important for Africans and for Americans to see that our histories are tied together and part of these same colonial projects, which I think is what was so powerful about the independence movements. They had their limitations, but they took on empires, and they were only able to do so because they saw how these structures of power were connected, how the history was connected, and they cannot be separated.
Okay, let's come to this burning issue of decolonization. And I mean, you give a very clear account, historical account of how, all this thinking was already happening. You even had a document there in 1973 that was giving a sense of what was happening around that question. We also are very much aware about work that has happened in the past, like with Ngugi wa Thiong'o and decolonizing the mind, which is probably very much in the space that you're talking about.
Yeah.
But we know that although there have been efforts, and there are recognizable efforts in the past, and this just didn't begin, with Rhodes Must Fall or Black Lives Matter and so on. This has been going on for quite a while, including in America. Why is it still so difficult? And in fact, there's one question here that's linked to that. So you mentioned the political systems in Africa have often adopted the same structures as the colonialists, as this is in the interest of many in power. So how does one begin to counter this? Because as though there are two counter movements happening. On the one hand, there's people say we must decolonization. On the other hand, there are people who are clinging onto the structures for whatever reasons. So is this ever going to change, or this sort of tension moving in different directions means that there's not going to be anywhere to go?
So I think at the heart of your question is, what is decolonization? Like, practically speaking, how does one decolonize, right? And whether or not it is possible to make progress and actually change these systems. And I think that real decolonization, the reason why it's very difficult to say how we can change these state structures is because real decolonization is really going through and, first of all, unearthing indigenous systems of knowledge. Not just indigenous practices, not just history of indigenous people, but indigenous systems of knowledge. To say, like, what is a man? How should man relate to nature? Part of the ecological crisis is that man's relationship to nature is the way in which the colonized views nature. It's not sacred. The rocks have no spirit. They're not related to the ancestors, right? So the very philosophy of what is man, what is nature, what is knowledge, what is power, has informed the structures that have come up. And so decolonization, as Frantz Fanon said, it's messy. It's very difficult to imagine because in a purely decolonized state, each society will have garnered its own philosophies and recreated structures, world structures based on those philosophies. And I think that we are moving towards at least understanding what that means and questioning some of these relationships in unearthing indigenous systems of knowledge and using the systems themselves as tools to see the other side of the world. For example, people often use postmodern theorists, Kant and Hegel, to study movements in Africa and social political events and even religious events in Africa. Why can't I use a traditional Ndebele lens to view what Trump is doing in the White House or what he did in the White House? Until we begin to see these systems as parallel systems and not as one with greater intellectual capacity, even though there's no proof of that, we cannot decolonize.
Would it be fair to say that we have to be very patient? This is not something that is going to happen anytime in the near future. In other words, people need to carry on thinking about it, talking about it, and so on and so forth. You know, there needs to be activism. But unless we get to the point where all these philosophical understandings have been reframed and rethought, etc., it could actually be a project of 2,000 years before we actually get to the other end. So are you telling us to be more realistic about it and not to expect that this is going to happen, you know, because there's a big, you know, sort of movement across the world and there's social media that is saying lots of stuff, that we should just calm down, begin with the roots, including philosophy and so on, reconstruct things, and this is going to take a very long time. Is that fair to say?
I mean, I don't know if the Earth has 2,000 years. Quite frankly, right? So, I mean, these are very philosophical questions that are at the heart of decolonial movements. But I think we also need activism and agitation, because even thinking about systems as not fixed, as systems as change, as like Western values, of some of these values and relationships, even if we don't know what they are and we can't put that into a structure, it's still important for us to make change by recognizing that this is not set in stone. This is not the essence of truth. This is not the way in which things should be. And so I think a lot of change can be created even without these fully fledged systems, just by recognizing that the status quo is historical. It can be moved. It has been moved in the past, and we must keep pushing. So I think we need both a bottom-up approach and a top-down approach for these movements.
Okay, so we need both approaches, and it could take a very long time, is what I'm taking away from what you're saying. And
yes, but it can take a long time, but real change can happen, like we saw with the calls for reparations. Real change can happen for many people in significant ways.
Right, fantastic, thank you. I want to come back to Judy on mining, and perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what you've observed so far about the unintended consequences of regulation by the government in this artisanal mining sector. So far, it's all very new, but so far, what have you observed?
I think I have to think about the unintended consequences, but one of the ones is what we were beginning to talk about, formalization, the challenges and expectations when it comes to, conducting, let's say the environmental assessment reports, the formal things that need to be done. And I think the big question is more in terms of the abilities. So the unintended consequences are where, individuals might feel that they may not want to be part of that formal process because of the cost implications and the burden of formalization, so to put it that way. And I think for us is, like I was saying, is how do you address these barriers that may be caused by, by the formalization process, because that is part of the legislation. The legislation requires them to do a few things before, they are registered, and if they are registered every year, they must do X, Y, Z. And so we have to think about, the burden and the implication, the cost implication of this, whether cost means financial or non-financial cost, and how do we go about, supporting them to still meet the requirements, but in ways that may not discourage them. So those are some of the things for me I see emerging out of the process. It's very new.
How about the question of environment? Because the environmental conversations tend to limit informal mining. How do ecological considerations manifest in your engagement with the various stakeholders? Because obviously one can imagine with all this sort of environmental way of thinking and so on and so forth, the informal sort of voice and agency might get drowned out.
Yes, so that's the disadvantage of the governing processes. But I just want to point out something. You mentioned environment, but I don't think you're using the environment in the environment, the green way of thinking. I'll just give an example. The regulation, for example, or the new laws defines artisanal mining in ways that actually disadvantages them and does not allow them to advance or use technology, modern technology. So it is very clear that, artisanal miners use rudimentary, elementary tools of engagement. And when you define them in a very traditional sense, it means that you limit their ability to progress. But the law might require them now, if you want to use a little bit of technology, then you must look for a different types of license. So we've got to also, critique how, these people are defined by law and how these definitions limit their abilities to be progressive, to adapt new technologies, new innovations and stuff like that. So there is a problem there, from that point of view. But also there is a problem in terms of if you institutionalize and say that, for you to do X, Y, Z, you must have formal committees. So you speak through committees, So that again, disadvantages some people, not all. It may advantage some, those with power, because even at community levels or informal sector, there are those with, power. There are those that are leaders in their own right. So it may advantage some and disadvantage others. So again, it's a matter of with this new mining regime, how do you develop governance arrangements that actually continue to give voice to these people, continue to give them agency, continues to empower them rather than disempower them, like in the example of innovation and technology? So it's work in progress, and I hope that as the ASM strategy is being developed, some of these things may be thought through, because we are only beginning to see the implications of the 2016 Mining Act and what that is really, how that is playing out, in the real lives of the mining stakeholders.
Okay, thank you, Judy. I'm going to give the last word to Naseemah. Naseemah, is decolonization at risk of being co-opted for different ends? You're on mute, sorry.
Yes, and what's interesting is that it has always been at risk for that co-opting. So that's the good news, right? Is that even in the independence movements, I came across articles which called out progressive liberals, and this was in the 1960s. They used the language of progressive liberals, who critique the ways in which activism is carried out more strongly than they do the injustices that led to that activism in the first place. And so I think that while it can be co-opted to mean diversity and inclusion, and these ideas of rainbow nation, we all hold hands and we live in peace and harmony, I also think that that has always been the case, and that the more that we learn about these movements, so I'm making the case for political history again, the more we learn about these movements and understand them, the more we can push back against that and really create change. And change is uncomfortable. It always has been, and it always will be.
I'm going to push you a little further because I have to ask this question. I think it's a very good question. Does intellectualization of decolonization leave out people like these local miners Judy is telling us about?
Of course.
Can you tell us more about that?
Of course, it does. I think we in the academy need to understand that we are Western educated, right? And that is one of the reasons I believe the decolonization movements of the 60s didn't change the structures, because they were Western educated. Even those working with socialism, and not to say that they didn't have indigenous systems of thought integrated within the movements, these were very strong, but in terms of the structures of the movements, because of financing, because of politics, because of the structures Judy's talking about too, they were limited in what they could do internationally on a large scale. And so, of course, we are products of the Western education model, and perhaps we can begin the process by critiquing our own position. I'm a Rhodes Scholar. I very much acknowledge that.
That's a fantastic note to conclude on. And it never ceases to amaze me how we set off thinking we have two very different topics. And then as the conversations develop, we realize how interlinked the conversations are. So it remains for me to thank the speakers and the audience, and we shall look forward to seeing you again next month. It's same time, 5 p.m. BST, and that's going to be Thursday, the 8th of July. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you for having us.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Judy. This is wonderful talk. I thoroughly enjoyed everything you had to say, and I have so many questions for you.